It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Hunter Whitehead, Principal Marine Archaeologist in the Marine Archaeology Division from Coastal Environments, Inc. in the USA. Hunter's personal research focus and speciality is on the study of submerged historic aircraft. His master's thesis focused on the documentation of two F-8F Bearcats, which crashed into the Gulf of Mexico off Pensacola, Florida during carrier qualification training in the 1950s. And in fact, some of you may recall that Hunter presented his thesis research at the NES conference in Newport in Wales way back in 2018. Tonight, Hunter will be talking to us about aviation heritage underwater, archaeological site formation processes, and other considerations. So Hunter, if you want to unmute yourself, it's over to you.
Thank you, Mark. First off, I just want to say I appreciate the invitation to give this presentation today. It has certainly been some time since I've seen an audience, and I guess today is not the day either. And wow, 2018, that does seem like such a long time ago now in light of world events. But I'll go ahead and get into it. Today I'll be talking about my one true love is sunken aircraft, and we'll be discussing site formation processes. So first off, let me just talk a little bit about myself. Everyone's favorite topic. Everybody likes to talk about themselves. I started off my career at the University of West Florida and had no idea what archaeology was. I just wanted to be underwater. I love scuba diving. And as I went through my college career, I discovered sunken aircraft as a thesis topic and realized, wow, nobody really studies this topic. There's probably 5 of us in the world that truly spend their time on it. And so after grad school, I did my master's thesis on 2 submerged F-8F Bearcats, and spent quite a bit of time and my own money just looking for airplanes off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. So I've presented at various conferences on this topic for the last 5 or 6 years. My master's thesis was basically a field study on photogrammetric modeling and how you can use photogrammetric modeling to monitor sites over time to determine minute changes via either whether that's cultural, people are affecting the wreck by taking things or leaving things, or environmental degradation processes, sand movement, that kind of thing. So after grad school, I got my master's. I went out and worked offshore, so I'm doing a lot of in the United States. It's Section 106 work that essentially ensures that any construction or dredging projects are not affecting submerged cultural resources. So I've spent a lot of time offshore doing remote sensing. I think in 2019, 2020, I probably spent 8 months offshore. And then by 2021, or by the end of 2020, I was really tired of being offshore. So I ended up joining Coastal Environments, which is an environmental culture resource firm that's been around since 1967. And I still spend a lot of time on a boat, but as you can see in this picture, I'm on a little bit smaller of a vessel than I was used to. So let me jump right into it. I like to show this image because this shows over time since 1994 how many aircraft related topic papers there have been at the Conference on Historical and Underwater Archaeology. And so you can see it's been kind of slow. The US government was still trying to figure out, okay, how do we deal with historic aircraft, and sort of just creating legislation around the study. And then by 2020, this you can see the number has shot up to 25 presentations on aviation. And that's largely because of organizers such as myself. I put on a symposium of about, I think, 15 people that presented on aviation. And then there's also another symposium dedicated to DPAA work, which is the U.S. Defense POW MIA accounting agency. So I always like to say that aviation archaeology is fairly new to the field, but this graph kind of shows that that's not exactly true. Maybe we're just now growing up. So this symposium in 2020 actually helped cultivate an edited volume on the subject of aviation archaeology that's going to be coming out in the next year or so. So pending reviews, edits, etc. And so this is actually my first volume that I've helped put together, so I'm pretty excited about it. So I just wanted to show this map, which is basically the study areas I'll be discussing today. I'll be discussing site formation processes on the underwater aircraft in the Gulf of Mexico, offshore Pensacola. And then I recently helped Wayne Lusardi, the state underwater archaeologist of Michigan, on a field study for Tuskegee Airman Bell P-39 Airacobra, and that's in Lake Huron. So, as I've mentioned, let's go back to this. I've been studying aircraft in Pensacola since my graduate studies in Pensacola, and so finding funding sources has been somewhat of a snag. But when I'm able to, I go out with local scuba diver captains, and they take me out to sites generally for free. And so most of the work so far has consisted of photography and taking better basic measurements. Excuse me. So I'm working closely with George Schwartz with the NHHC, which is the Naval History and Heritage Command, on organizing a geophysical survey in Pensacola. And the plan is to, essentially move forward with basic reconnaissance surveys in January. And it just so happens that the Naval Oceanographic Office does their multi-beam training in Pensacola. So they've offered to give us some assistance. And so there will definitely be more research here to come shortly. Naval Air Station Pensacola is renowned as the cradle of naval aviation and has been a fundamental pilot training facility for the U.S. Navy since its establishment in 1914. World War I ensured aviation would remain an important aspect of U.S. naval warfare, and it led to an increased influx of prospective aviation cadets at NAS Pensacola. So the subsequent decades of training led to hundreds of training accidents and loss of naval aircraft in the waters of Pensacola. So far I've examined 12 aircraft of various types in offshore Pensacola and have been provided locations of 40 additional aircraft by local scuba divers. So there's a lot more work to do. The second study area is Lake Huron, where the U.S. Army Air Corps utilized Michigan airfields to provide advanced training for Tuskegee Airmen in 1943 and 1944. A Bell P-39Q Airacobra flown by Lieutenant Frank Moody was discovered in 2014 by a local scuba diver, who then contacted the state underwater archaeologist, Wayne Lusardi. Wayne has conducted several field seasons on the aircraft since its initial phase 1 study in 2015. And this year, Wayne contacted me to assist with the 2021 fieldwork activities. And that's what's allowed me to make comparisons between the two study areas today. So right into the weeds. What is site formation processes? So underwater archaeologist Keith Muckelroy in the 1960s, 1970s formulated a lens in which to view a shipwreck's depositional processes. His extracting filters, which are mechanisms that take away material from the site, include the wrecking process, salvage, disintegration of perishable items, and then due to extracting filters, material are no longer present on the site and therefore not observable in the archaeological record. The other device is the scrambling device, which involves the process of moving artifacts during and after deposition, causing loss of contextual data. These scrambling devices include the wrecking event and any subsequent environmental progression, such as wave action, currents, marine life interaction, until the ship is part of the seascape, at which time any further alterations of the wreck become an effect of seabed movement. Muckelroy's terminology and site formation framework has been widely incorporated and also altered and supplemented by archaeologists seeking to explain cultural and environmental factors. Ingrid Ward et al. Point out that the faults in Muckelroy's findings and assert that his research failed to effectively link the physical attributes of the wreck site with the processes controlling wreck formation. Instead of referring to the wrecking event as a single process, Ward et al. Assert that there are multiple processes that affect a site, including physical, biological, and chemical. Martin Gibbs weighs in and he emphasizes that cultural processes that he states have been given less attention than those natural, and divides these processes into categories such as the pre-wrecking life history of the ship, immediate salvaging of the crew, or by the crew, and modern salvaging and looting events. So he further defines a difference between the wrecks that were scuttled intentionally and those that were a result of catastrophic events. So Muckelroy addresses cultural processes briefly, but the majority is on natural processes. These cultural processes may act as extracting filters that take material away from the site or scrambling devices that reduce archaeological context. Martin Gibbs expands on the cultural factors of jettisoning, salvage, and recreational diver impacts. Richard Gould's research examines pre-depositional factors such as the life history of the ship, risk minimization strategies, and precautionary preparations of vessels. These types of cultural factors would have an effect on the depositional process, such as catastrophic wreck events. Alternatively, Gibbs identifies intentional scuttling as a second type of wrecking event. A scuttled vessel would show a contrasting artifact pattern since most materials that held any value would have been removed. So where did aircraft come into play here? A study by Samantha Bell for her master's thesis at Flinders posits that by utilizing Muckelroy's shipwreck site formation model, it's possible to cultivate a submerged aircraft specific model. There are obviously dissimilarities, and these chiefly owe to depositional differences between a watercraft that belongs on the water and an aircraft that belongs in the air. In addition, materials present on each site will affect the respective degradation rates. Yet, despite these differences, some site formation post-depositional factors will be similar. So, cultural factors such as looting and salvaging obviously will persist on any accessible site. There will always be looters, as will environmental factors will always affect the physical, biological, and chemical nature of a ship or an aircraft site. So focusing on the pre-deposition, the key difference in these factors is that the stages will kind of reveal between wreck formation and the archaeological signature. One key difference between shipwrecks and aircraft wrecks is the wrecking event itself. So although scuttling events do occur, most aircraft sank due to catastrophic wrecking events. In this case, the pre-depositional process does not start in the water, but in the air. There are two types of catastrophic failures in my mind, those which the pilot has some degree of control and those which the pilot does not. These two types of events may be the result of warfare activities, training accidents, mechanical issues, weather-related mishaps, but the degree of control the pilot has over the aircraft affects the level of impact. So for example, harder impacts may see wider dispersal of an aircraft's components over the seafloor when compared to softer landings that allow the aircraft to remain intact. And we're going to see that in these studies. Once the aircraft reaches the seafloor or lake bottom, similar extracting filters and scrambling devices that affect shipwrecks exist. Samantha Bell has applied shipwreck site formation theories to aircraft and determined it's possible to apply shipwreck models with minor alterations. She compares differences between aircraft wrecks in high and low energy environments, the former which is more susceptible to physically dominated deterioration, while the latter is subject to chemically and biologically dominated deterioration. Aside from environmental processes, the cultural processes that affect aircraft are fundamentally similar to shipwrecks. Minor differences exist, such as quantity or lack of artifacts on submerged aircraft sites. Pilots and crew took very few personal belongings on board. So the main artifact assemblage of an aircraft site is the aircraft's components and perhaps ammunitions. Systematic salvage operations possibly occur on aircraft very soon after deposition as well. So overall, I think Keith Muckelroy's well-founded site formation model for shipwrecks definitely can be applied to aircraft. The innate differences between aircraft and ships are minimal when considering the depositional and post-depositional stages, and an additional pre-depositional stage that reflects the period between the initiation of wrecking event and the water collision, and that's crucial. So essentially an aircraft will have multiple forces impacting the airframe. And then another key difference is with the material composition, obviously. Wooden or steel frame ships compared to aluminum framed aircraft. So in addition to that, site dispersal debris fields of aircraft wrecks might be widespread depending on the collision type. So now that I've bored you to death, let's get into the nitty-gritty. The Pensacola aircraft that I've studied, I believe, just judging from aircraft accident reports that I've seen, most of these aircraft are actually trying to land on aircraft carriers or take off from aircraft carriers when they wreck. So what does that mean for the pre-depositional process? Well, they're going a lot slower than if they were, shot down or something of that nature. So you can see this F8F Bearcat, it is probably trying to land in this picture on the deck of an aircraft carrier, and so for some reason took a hard left and is going to be dumped in the water there. So you can see that the aviator is able to escape the cockpit, and that airplane is probably just going to sink down to the seafloor and just lay pretty softly. This is inside the cockpit of an F8F Bearcat in Pensacola, and you can see many of the gauges have been taken out, is what I assume. And actually, I know for sure I had someone approach me who actually had the gauges and wanted to give them back. So you've definitely got your cultural processes the scuba community in Pensacola has been diving on these aircraft since the 1960s. So it's sort of become a hobby to go down and see what you can bring back. This is that same F8F Bearcat. What's cool about this, I took this in 2016 or 2015. You can see that the engine is over to the left of the aircraft, about 20 meters away. The propeller blade is bent from when the aircraft struck the water, is what I'm assuming. This is that same aircraft. You can see all the shells inside. So there's a better picture of that propeller blade, the R2800 Pratt & Whitney engine with the propeller blade that's bent. Here is a photogrammetric model of that same aircraft that I created for my master's thesis. Another image there. And so this is what's kind of cool about working with the local scuba community, is that they've been diving on these things for so long that they have seen the changes, how the aircraft are being affected by the environment. This is that same aircraft, the F8F Bearcat, right here. And you can see that the wing is still much more intact and the landing gear is down. And so that's really how we know that this was in fact an aircraft that was landing on an aircraft carrier, because if you're going to crash in the water, you would not want your landing gear to be down. And here's that same aircraft again. You can see there is an anchor that's been dropped on the tail of the aircraft. It's not known whether this has been, if that's negatively impacted the aircraft over time, but I would assume so. You drag an anchor over something like aluminum frame of an aircraft, and it's not going to do anything but damage. So for my master's thesis, I was able to collect photogrammetric data and determine how much of the aircraft is in fact left. And you can see from this image, it's really not that much. So here is a second F8F Bearcat, and it is even in worse shape, or the wings are underneath the sediment. And over time, over the study, I probably visited these two sites 8 or 9 times over the course of 2 years. And every time I went back, the sediment was different, you know, either scoured out on one side or was being buried by sediment. There's another image there. The fish in this area, they absolutely love aircraft for some reason. So when I was trying to collect photogrammetric video data, it was really kind of a nightmare. And the person teaching me at the time said, there's no way you're going to be able to create a photogrammetric model. Well, in fact, I did. And you know, I very promptly sent him an image of that model and said, check this out. So here's that F8F Bearcat again, and with how much is actually left intact. There are pieces of the aircraft scattered about. I was able to find part of the landing gear, if I remember correctly, is about 30 meters away, kind of sunk into the sediment. More fish. This is a F6F Hellcat. This is what's left of a TBM Avenger. And I've got an additional, it's a bad image. This is from VHS that I was able to convert to digital. This is apparently that same aircraft, and it's been torn up by hurricanes in the Gulf over the last 70 years. So not much is left, at least in situ on site. And so this is an A7 Corsair jet that went down in the 1980s, also trying to land on an aircraft carrier. What I find interesting about this and the next several slides is that, you know, obviously the landing gear's down, but it's inverted. And excuse me. And I'm wondering if there's something about the aircraft type that makes it inverted while it's sinking, or whether it is just rolled over during hurricane events. So another hazy picture, but this is another F6F Hellcat that's actually inverted upside down. I've seen this in various pictures online where I think a lot of aircraft carrier accidents, for whatever reason, the sinking process is so slow, and perhaps air gets caught in the cockpit or something of that nature, and it actually flips it upside down. And here's another hazy picture. I've not identified this aircraft yet. There's not much left of it, but I'd like to get back and do a little bit more research on it. Another trainer, also unidentified, but you can tell there's been some serious degradation on this aircraft. Basically the whole airframe is gone. And so now we're getting into the P-39Q that's in Lake Huron. This is what it would look like in air. During the recent field season, we spent a lot of time doing just basic measurements, drawings. I think the plan is eventually to actually recover this aircraft and put it on display in Detroit at a museum. So just gathering as much information in situ is as important as collecting these artifacts. This is Wayne Lusardi, who is recording the wing portion, and it's really quite fantastic. You can still see the star insignia of the U.S. Air Corps. And some of the observations I've really made about the differences between the Lake Huron aircraft, which is freshwater, and the Pensacola Gulf of Mexico aircraft is there seems to be pretty much the same rate of degradation. The P-39 actually, Frank Moody was on a gunnery mission, just training mission. So he was actually firing live rounds when something happened. You know, the accounts are kind of vague, but something happened, and he actually landed in the water, and apparently the aircraft just absolutely exploded. There are parts of this aircraft, I think, within a half square mile radius. So there's just pieces everywhere, making it quite difficult to understand what exactly happened. There's the engine section. This is much further away. I don't have the exact number in front of me than the wing section. There's a tail section, and we recorded this summer, and in fact, several weeks after we recorded it, the tail section ended up moving several hundred yards away, and we don't think this was due to human interactions. We think there was a storm recently that actually carried the tail much further away from the rest of the site. So that makes us wonder if the site was a little bit more secure at one point, and just over time the pieces and sections of it have kind of moved. And lastly, I really want to touch on this because this has been a very interesting development. This is the propeller hub with one propeller attached. The other two propeller blades had not been located during any of the previous field seasons, but the same scuba diver who acts sort of as a steward of the site, he ended up finding another propeller blade. And so when he did this, he discovered that there was actually a 50 cal bullet hole in the propeller blade. So what this means is it is possible that Frank Moody was doing his gunnery practice, and the synchronization gear in his 50 cal machine guns on the nose of the aircraft failed, which caused him to actually shoot his own airplane down. So when Wayne discovered or heard about this development, he went back and looked at this propeller blade, which you can see is very encrusted. And he actually kind of scraped a little section away. Well, in fact, in the same exact place, there is another bullet hole. So it's the evidence is mounting, and we really think it's possible that there was some sort of failure with the synchronization gear. And looks like I've still got quite a bit of time, but thank you very much. Hopefully that opens us up for a lot of questions. I'm happy to answer whatever you got. Please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Wayne. Gosh, we got there pretty quick. We got there already. Do you want to turn your camera on, and then we can see that you're genuinely with us? What time is it where you are?
We've got 1:34 or 1:32.
For those of you that aren't aware, Hunter's just gone to and had his Thanksgiving work lunch today already before giving his presentation. Thank you for that. I mean, gosh, Muckelroy takes me back to university days. Blimey, in that the famous book, Maritime Archaeology. Presumably, you studied undergraduate, postgraduate. Muckelroy is still sort of heavily taught, heavily relied upon, or is used as a basis for the discipline, the subject in the US?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So in terms of comparing your the application of Muckelroy's site formation processes to aircraft, the big difference for you was that aircraft, of course, aren't, most of them anyway, unless maybe it's a seaplane, aren't actually intentionally on the water.
Exactly. I mean, it's sort of basic, right? You know, airplanes supposed to be in the air. There are seaplanes that float planes that are meant to land on the water, but they do so in more or less okay ways. They're still not meant to be on the water. That's not their primary focus.
So the big difference for site formation, of course, is that if it's had a collision or is losing parts, components in the air, then the scatter, the field, the debris field, for want of a,
Yes.
Is that the phrase, the right phrase? The debris field potentially is huge.
Exactly. And in the case of the P-39, one of the accident report, they actually talk about how it cartwheeled across the water. So it was just absolutely a horrible accident. And so as you notice, the fuselage on the wing there is no fuselage on the wing. The fuselage is nowhere to be found. So this thing just absolutely exploded. Whereas a lot of the aircraft in Pensacola, they're more or less in better shape. They still look like an aircraft for the most part. Over time, big storm events have kind of chipped away at the wings and things like that. There's a really great story about a AD Skyraider, which is a very, very large aircraft. It's World War II era aircraft. And so these scuba divers in Pensacola found this thing back in the 80s and had been diving on it for years and years and years. And it was just completely together. It actually had landed right on the sediment, still had its landing gear down. and then a hurricane came through in I think 2005, and it is nowhere to be seen. It's like it took off one more time, and it's just
Wow.
gone. Yeah.
And has never seen again.
Never seen again. Hasn't never been seen. So it's either under a bunch of sediment or just was blown apart.
My goodness, because I
Or
suppose if
just
it's
at a
so
completely different location.
yeah. Well, yeah, it's gone up, and then its wings, if it's so intact, it's almost sailed along the seabed.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess airplane wings work pretty well underwater as well, with currents and things like that.
So since the First World War, is the principal component or the principal material aluminium?
Yes, it's an alloy. Various manufacturers had their own particular alloy, and then I think at some point, it must have been World War II, they started armoring their aircraft a little bit better. So you have steel plates where the cockpit is to sort of protect the pilot a little bit more.
And how does aluminium survive in? I mean, obviously there you've got World War One, World War Two planes. These things are going to go eventually, aren't they? Presumably.
I think that's the general consensus is that we better study them now because they may not be there in the future to be studied, and it depends on how well they're buried. You know, if they're buried in some sediment, you know, you're not getting as much oxygen to degrade them as much. But there are definitely ongoing studies to determine corrosion rates and things of that nature.
I'm assuming that engines, being the most robust, heavily built parts, are the most common to survive on the seabed.
Absolutely, and actually that makes them a little bit easier to be discovered. So if you're running a magnetometer, you know, the engine, that's what you're going to be detecting. And so if you have a buried aircraft, the only thing that you'd really be able to find would be the engine. Yeah.
And then other materials presumably are rubber, plastic.
Rubber, plastic.
Small amount of wood, but
depending on the aircraft. Early aircraft obviously were built. And actually, I found a reference to a World War One aircraft off Pensacola that's in the Shipwreck database. So I'm kind of curious. It's about 30 miles offshore, so it's a little far out. But I've never heard of a World War One aircraft being found underwater. Generally, probably because the materials would not last as well.
Yeah. So in your work, commercially, professionally, how much of it is in terms of doing surveys in advance of development, you know, impact on cultural material? How much of it is shippy? How much of it actually is airplane? Obviously, your personal interest is airplane.
Yes, and actually, I had not considered airplanes for quite some time because most of my work is sitting on a boat and collecting side scan sonar data or multi-beam data and that sort of thing. And most of the time we don't find anything. So it's a lot of looking and usually a whole lot of nothing. But the cultural resources that I do discover are generally modern shipwrecks, things of that nature. I have not found any aircraft that I can speak of commercially yet.
Which of course is what the commercial developer wants you not to find anything.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, we do have some questions that have come in. There's a question from Gerardo about depth of things that we were looking at in terms of your case studies.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I guess I should have mentioned that. So the P-39 is in freshwater. It's in about 30 feet. So we were doing 2.5, 3-hour dives on those, getting a lot of work done. Most of the Pensacola aircraft I'd shown, I think they range from 60 feet to 140, something like that. And, you know, 140 feet, you have to have special gas mixes and things of that nature, special training. And so you really don't have that much time on those. So when it comes down to it, collecting video is just really important, because you may have 10, 15 minutes to really study it at a time.
Oh yeah, no, the revolution of being able to collect digital video and then to capture the stills from that and to turn that into photogrammetry surveys is just phenomenal in terms of
Oh, it's
how
really cool.
quickly you can collect data nowadays.
You know, I must say, I at this point in my career, I really hate making photogrammetric models. It's just really time consuming. But then I get to the end of it and I'm like, oh wow, well that was worth it. This is really quite fantastic. And you know, to be able to show that in a museum, or just show it online, and people are just always really excited about 3D models.
Yeah,
It makes it worth it.
yeah. We got a question from Graham. Are the aircraft landing and taking off from land or from a mock-up aircraft carrier or vessel?
No. So in Pensacola, well, let me rephrase that. In World War II, most of our aircraft carrier qualification training was in the Great Lakes, and the idea behind that was to protect the aircraft carrier training itself, but also most of the aircraft carriers were overseas in action. So in 1945, at the end of the war, the aircraft carriers started kind of returning home, and several were used for training. So they were just running back and forth every single day, probably landing, I think I've read 16 to 20 aircraft a day. And so you can imagine these young, I don't know, 18, 19-year-old kids really landing on these aircraft carriers. It's a small target, and if you've got any movement, it's probably a pretty difficult task.
Can you imagine being 18 years old and flying planes and landing them in training and on aircraft carriers? It's just, I mean, when I was 18, I could, well, I'm not sure. There's not much I could probably do, probably. It's just incredible what people did. Presumably serial numbers are really important for identification in terms of actually being able to put a name or number to a plane to then actually work out, not necessarily the type of aircraft, but actually which actual aircraft and potentially which pilot that was.
Yes, that's extremely important, especially in an area like Pensacola where there's just so many accidents. And I think there were, for example, there were 4 F-8F Bearcats that crashed off Pensacola, and so we have 2 of them that we know about, but whether we have the actual one or the other, it's hard to determine identity. Usually on naval aircraft, you've got a plate that's right inside the cockpit. Unfortunately, the plate is on neither of these aircraft, whether they just degraded. I mean, it's a small aluminum plate, or someone found it and said, well, that's interesting, and they cut it out, which is sort of just the way things go. They were in fact able to, as in Wayne, was able to determine the identity of the P-39 because the radio call signs were still etched into the radio that would have been in the cockpit. So that's
Wow.
really pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. That is smart. I like that. Because yes, in a ship context, of course, you want the bell that's got a name on it.
Sure.
And of course, in most cases, you never actually ever find the bell. It's all the other little bits of evidence that point into the most likely candidate for the name of the vessel, rather than actually being able to wholeheartedly 100% guaranteed. And presumably that's true for planes as well. We've got a question from Nick. Nick says or asks, do you collaborate with the ground-based aviation archaeology community?
I've not had anybody really reach out to me. I've mainly focused on the underwater side of things, but it's not that different. The materials are obviously the same. What I've kind of found is that most of the times the ground-based, the terrestrial aircraft wreck sites have been picked clean because people know about them. their grandfather told them a story that said, "Oh yeah, I remember this aircraft," and so they then go looking for that aircraft, and just generations of looting or salvage.
It still amazes me today that you hear stories of people coming across the remains of aircraft in the mountains that have been literally, it seems that no one else has ever seen them, and that the plane's gone down and walkers or hikers just happen to come across this plane that's untouched for 60, 80 years. Incredible, absolutely incredible. Okay, we got a question from Lutz. Is electrochemical degradation between the frame and the hull contributing to wreck degradation under the water? So the airframe and the, I suppose it's the electrochemical reactions between the two metal types.
So yeah, the different alloys is definitely going to cause further degradation. Although I'll be very honest, that is not my specialty, and I know the right people to talk to. So I'm happy to share papers or things of that nature on specifically on that subject.
Yeah, I get asked questions about conservation all the time. It's like, not my expertise.
Yeah.
Okay, we got a question about, and I know you guys were quite sensitive about this over the weekend, but have you encountered human remains, and if so, what protocols do you observe with respect to military graves? What's the law? Is everything automatically protected?
Oh, absolutely, especially remains. So on any archaeological site and that remains are found, you have to have a plan in place. So let me take a step back. No, we have not found any remains on any of these sites. That's not to say that there may not be DNA left, but I think mainly the aircraft that I've studied in Pensacola, the pilots were able to get out since they were landing so softly. They were able to get out fairly quickly. But generally, if you're on an archaeological project, a permitted project, you would have to contact the local coroner and the state historic preservation officer. So it's essentially an all stop. There's no more work that can be done on that site. And you have to confirm that it is in fact a historic remains, not someone who just got picked off by the mob or something.
We were visited in Fort Cumberland at the NES offices earlier on in the year by two representatives from the MIA POW accounting agency who were in the UK on a research and networking and kind of trip, meeting with as many people as they could. And that job, I mean, I don't know whether that's kind of a dream job, but that sounded an incredible job to be able to try to repatriate human remains from aircraft and vessels and obviously on land for then repatriation back to the US. I mean, that's an organization that's existed since the end of what, I suppose, is it the end of the Second World War? Do you know?
No, I think that the CRL, which was the cultural, it's out of Hawaii. I think they started sometime in the 80s, and it kind of formed them into what it is today. And they've sort of changed acronyms a couple times. But you're right. I mean, that must be just such a rewarding job, knowing that you're returning someone's family member home to them. And they are archaeologists and forensic archaeologists or anthropologists working on those projects, but it's not, they're using archaeological methods, but the main object or goal for those projects is to return those servicemen and women home. So most of the time, they're not sharing any of the archaeological data with the scientific community. And just because it's, you don't want to share something about someone's family before they even know that they're in fact home. So
I remember them talking to me about that, saying that, until something is 100% confirmed and then the family is informed and then the family has consented, then it's all hush. It's all very,
and I think it does happen that they're able to share some of that stuff, but it's not very often.
No, I suppose not. And yes, then they did say that whilst they're there to they document the context of the remains, that's not what their task is not to recover the plane or to recover the ship or even part of it, or even any other cultural material. It's just the human remains. But it did sound, I mean, just meeting them was an incredible, they were with me for about an hour and a half in the office. It was an incredible experience.
Well, and they're able to go to some very remote places too, and meet with people who say their grandfather remembers an aircraft going down in some bay. And so they're able to pinpoint, yeah, this is where my grandfather said he saw an aircraft going down. So very, very cool stuff.
I didn't realize how popular aviation archaeology was until doing research and before your presentation with Wayne at the weekend, because you know, on Facebook there's a public group with 34,000 members.
Oh, it's nuts. And I'll be honest with you, most of those people want to go salvage the aircraft, and some want to actually restore the aircraft and fly it. And I'm like, aircraft's been down underwater 70 years. I'm not sure I want to fly in that one.
No, yes, well, yeah, rather them than me, most definitely. Okay. Okay, well, unless there are any more questions, anyone else want to put anything in the chat or the questions, the Q&A? If not, we shall leave it there. You've got your last chance.